Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nabila Zulfikar, and I was co-chair of Working Group 7, which is the Building Designers Working Group, and I'm representing the Architects Registration Board today. In relation to the work of the group, if I can just start by saying that around 1 year ago, or just over a year ago, I walked into a room of about 30 professionals, individuals at the RICS offices, which are based in Westminster, and I was attending a meeting of the Competence steering group. It was my first meeting, and I was attending in my capacity as co-chair of the Building Designers Working Group. And I felt some trepidation and some apprehension when I walked into that meeting. The reason for that is because I'm not a construction professional, and I'm not a building designer. So what was I doing there? Well, I was there because I was a member of the Architects Registration Board, and I chaired the board until January this year. But I'm a solicitor and adjudicator by profession, so I had some experience of professional regulation. And there are many ways that you can describe the 30 or so people that were in that room at the time. A description could be that they were very vocal, robust, argumentative, you could say, or alternatively, you could describe them as being passionate, dedicated, and willing to take responsibility for the important tasks that we had to consider. And I'll say, just for the record, that I prefer that latter view. So I presented the competence framework for building designers, and that framework has been designed by a group of equally dedicated and passionate professionals coming from diverse disciplines. And that included architecture, architectural technicians, surveying, and fire safety experts. And the scope for our work was to design a framework for assuring and maintaining standards of competence for building designers, specifically working on what we are now calling in-scope buildings, so higher risk residential buildings. And the first thing we had to do was actually define who are building designers. So if somebody wants to be accredited as a building designer and use this framework, I certainly thought that it had to be quite important for us to set out who may fall within the definition of a building designer. So these are the individuals or professions that we came up with, and we included engineers where they wouldn't be covered by another competence framework. And within there, we also included others because we don't know how this industry is going to evolve over time. And what we wanted to do was produce a framework that is flexible and adaptable and also fit for the future. We also looked at the current context in which these professionals work. And many of you may know that generally building designers are subject to some kind of professional regulation. So either because they have to be registered to call themselves, say, an architect, or they choose voluntary membership of a professional body, for example, the Royal Institution for Chartered Surveyors. So these bodies have codes of conduct already, or standards that their members have to adhere to, and they're expected to comply with those standards. They also have disciplinary powers if there are any individual breaches of those standards. But as we all know, that has not been sufficient in the context of the Hackett Review. So in terms of the work that we did, the first thing we wanted to do was actually identify the purpose, the fundamental purpose for all professionals involved in working on higher risk residential buildings. And we came up with this purpose, that all professionals involved in working in those in-scope buildings are there to deliver better living and working lives for the public. And that must be common, I believe, to everyone working in such a building. It's a really simple and relatable purpose that we would commend to you, and we suggest that that will enable the cultural shift that was identified by Dame Judith Hackett to take place. That purpose would be underpinned by some simple and, again, relatable core principles. Buildings matter, people matter, and professionalism matters. Again, simple standards that everyone working on a higher risk residential building should be able to understand and adhere to. And those core principles are underpinned by core behaviours and then core knowledge and also specialist knowledge that would apply to each professional. So that is something that we've expanded on in the competence framework and in the consultation document. And this is a snapshot really of the main recommendations in relation to the competence framework for building designers, and it identifies the following. First of all, eligibility. So for building designers, we would expect somebody working or being accredited and re-accredited to be a member of a professional body, so subject to those standards and a disciplinary regime that I've mentioned, and of course to have the necessary qualifications and experience. And those that there would be 5 areas of competence that those individuals would be accredited against, and those are set out there, and there is more detail is contained within the consultation document and the framework. So that sets out each of the detailed levels of competence that are required, and those are assessed against 4 levels, ranging from an awareness of each level of competence or each area of competence, right through to having comprehensive knowledge. And we have proposed, and again this is for consultation, that re-accreditation would take place every 5 years. And that re-accreditation would include an assessment portfolio, and I think that was mentioned by somebody this morning, as well as potentially an interview. We also have identified, for those of you who've read the Raising the Bar interim report, issues and risks, and I've seen that that's been picked up in the press as well, certainly the architectural press. So clearly there will be some costs in relation to introducing this new system, and potentially that could be passed on to the client or ultimately people who live in and work in or use the relevant buildings. Insurance issues have been highlighted. The fact that because this activity is in an area that will be reserved to those who are accredited, will there be enough people who want to be accredited to undertake this work? And also, these are questions that we have identified as part of the consultation document, and we would welcome your views on how to resolve these issues. Within that, there are also opportunities that arise, certainly within the building designers profession, because you've heard that there is going to be this statutory role of a principal designer. And we believe that building designers would be well suited to that proposed statutory role. There is also career progression, learning and development. So again, it was mentioned this morning, how are we going to bring on those people who are new to building design to ultimately be accredited and work on these buildings, and that would be through career progression, learning and development. And what we'd like to see is that these competence frameworks raise competence again, across professions and trades, and that would permeate through other types of buildings as well. So those core purposes and principles would actually be used by those professionals when they're working across other areas. I'd like to finish now by saying that you've heard this morning that legislation is going to be implemented by the end of this year. Phase 1 of the Grenfell Tower inquiry is coming to a close, and Phase 2 is going to start next year. So where are we? Well, there is no option to do nothing. I realised only a few weeks ago, actually, that I work in an in-scope building. So I'm based at level 12 of the Cube, which is a building in Birmingham, which has offices, flats, and shops. And I go into that building every day assuming it's safe. After all, it's fairly new, it's only 10 years old. But then I thought of a comment that was made earlier in relation to the construction industry in the last 20 years not living up to expectations. But I remind you also that Grenfell Tower was also new once. So we'll probably all have to visit, work in or live in an in-scope building at some point in our lives. So I would ask you to make this personal as it is for me and take responsibility for the future, because people matter, buildings matter, and professionalism matters.
Graham opened up by saying that he realised he was approaching 40 years in the industry. It's 42 years since I first put on my fireman's uniform and yellow helmet and my career started, which was quite remarkable because I was only 3 years old at the time. But a lot has happened in that period. In those early years, we were dealing with 1,000 fire deaths a year in the UK. We've now got down to less than 300, and there's been several massive changes, some innovations that have brought about those changes, and it's had a byproduct, from my perspective, of leading us into somewhat complacent attitude to fire risk. Anyway, the reason I'm stood here is I was asked to be Secretary of Working Group 3 that looked at fire engineers. We had probably the most simple remit of all of the areas that Dame Judith said needed to look at professional systems. We've got a relatively small number of people that are already feel that they're professionals, they're already putting themselves forward for professional accreditation and recognition, and they recognise the value of CPD. But no, we need to go further, we need to live to the objective of raising the bar. So what did we do? We looked at what a fire engineer should be doing in the building work process, helping people identify a competent fire engineer, ensuring that ethics is in that equation and is embedded in the process. Maintenance of knowledge is critical, possibly re-registration and reaffirmation. Hackett said that should be compulsory, and we've got no fear of that, and that there should also be a means and practice of sharing safety critical information. So by bringing together, that one? Yeah, that worked. Bringing together a cross-section of those that were willing to give their time to look at answering those questions, the working group produced a number of key points. We weren't going to run away and identify and devise a system for competence for fire engineers that was different to competence for engineers per se. Why would we? If you're turning to an engineer to do a role in a building, you should be able to look for that confidence that the badge of the Engineering Council carries the same weight across all of the PEIs. So we shadowed in the initial stages the work of Working Group 1. What is it going to do to set up this new system, to set the new bar for those that are going to work on whatever in-scope buildings are? But we couldn't sit back and do nothing. We had to sit down and talk to each other about, well, actually, when should a fire engineer be deployed? And how do we answer our own questions? We've already got solutions by the professional body being licensed by the Engineering Council. All of those that are registered as engineering technicians, incorporated engineers or chartered engineers are committed to a programme of CPD with varying amounts of hours commitment dependent on their level. We're already testing the knowledge of people in a particular sphere, and we think that's particularly important to give confidence when the procurement teams and the specifiers are looking for that specialism. We also have the Code of Professional Conduct. Well, that is absolutely essential and something that our members are very opinionated about. They feel that there are a lot of competent people out there but not behaving ethically, and that there needs to be a means of the body overseeing the competence and ethics in application. They should be subject to a disciplinary process, and I ask you to cast your mind across to the medical world, who have faced all sorts of challenges in the last 20 years, but their solution has been to create the respect for the colleges, respect for the professional institutions that work with the protected terms of such as dentists and paramedics and those specialisms. We also recognise that in our process we need a means for whistleblowing. Scott spoke earlier about the need for competent organisations. There needs to be confidence for individuals to be able to say this organisation isn't doing the right thing without fear of them losing their position. the proposals for the future from Working Group 3, that the proposed duty holders should only appoint professionally registered fire engineers to carry out safety critical work on in-scope buildings. A number of variables in there, aren't there? Who are going to be the duty holders, and what is going to be in scope? How can we set this new raised bar without knowing what the buildings are, what the complexities the engineers are going to face? The proposed revised REBA plan of works must include reference to skills including fire engineering, and it was good to hear discussions and Peter confirming that there are steps in that direction. Key fire engineering deliverables should be produced as part of the design process. Safety case is two short words meaning a great deal, but if the safety case doesn't start with the design, if it doesn't start with, we're going to build this building, it's going to be used for this, and we're going to make it safe by doing these things, part of that requires the knowledge of a fire engineer to ensure that those things are the right things for that building. And that the Institution of Fire Engineers will continue to work with CROSS to satisfy another of Dame Judith's recommendations in widening the scope of confidential reporting to include fire safety matters. I've only got 1 minute left and I've finished the slides. I wanted to make, as Nabila did, a bit of a personal plea. 42 years of scars from the fire industry, giving me the opportunity to stand here today to say we can make a difference. I think Lindsay's left from MHCLG, am I right? Which I know that we can all think about doing the right things. We can set up all of the systems to ensure that we can identify professionals. But I really don't think that professionals will be deployed as they should be unless there's some form of compulsion. Unless there's some teeth in the system that says you should only be employing those people that are wearing that particular qualification, competence and assurance of their ethics. And really, that's where I want to finish. We can raise the bar, we can do the right things, we can easily convert the systems we have today, but we need impetus and we need the energy of the regulator behind to ensure that happens. Thank you very much.
Mark Snelling, Association of Residential Managing Agents. Somebody asked me the question last night, what is a fire engineer? And it's that we talk about competent fire engineers, and you mentioned 3 tiers of registered people within your organisation. And there's also been a discussion that a fire engineer could be a fire modeller who would not be appropriate for, or may not be appropriate for the design of buildings. Can you just expand on that? Because I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, and that's the nub of a question, that is, how do you select the right person for the job? Fire engineer started out as someone that dealt with the fire engine. That the 1918 fire engineers were all fire officers in the fire service looking at the science of extinguishing fire and had some foresight about preventing fire in the future. What really matters here is that the designer, the specifier, seeks the appropriate person, and that the appropriate person works within their scope of knowledge. That's where the ethics fits into this. That if you approach me and ask me to design a smoke control system, I'm going to say, no, you need a smoke control specialist. I'm a fire engineer of sorts, and there are probably 20 other people in this room that have fire engineering skills. What we need for satisfying Dame Judith is a new bar for people who can demonstrate that they have the level of skills and are likely to behave appropriately in the type of buildings that the new regulator will have control over.
Paul White again. Just could I ask what the plan is for a fire engineer as a duty holder to increase their knowledge of smoke control engineering, because that would perhaps be a key requirement there?
Paul, I think you'll find in the MHCLG consultation, they identify just 3 duty holders: the principal designer, principal contractor and building safety manager. We would expect at all stages for those duty holders to appoint competent persons to assist them, and amongst that a fire engineer, And if smoke control is a critical part of the safety case for the building, that they employ someone with appropriate skills and qualifications to give assurance that they're fit for purpose to design, maintain, manage the smoke control system. It's not for the fire engineers at the moment to be identifying that.
Okay, no, thank you for that.
Sorry, I was trying to think of a question on smoke control then. But even though many of us are competent, we perform much better if we've got independent scrutiny. Now, what I wanted to ask is, do you see a need for scrutiny of the world of designers? And if so, how should it be done?
Registered qualified architect. Been working in the industry for 40 years. Always in the private sector. Do designers need inspectors to check their design? In individual businesses and practices and local authorities, we work in teams. So the teamwork is the check. What we heard today from Mr. Stedman, which slightly excited me, was the fact that we're going to have a principal designer who may not be a designer. I am slightly surprised and concerned of that approach. However, it's intriguing, and I think it needs further examination.
I'd just like to take up that point, actually. I've worked in the industry for 40 years. I'm a chartered engineer. I have worked on a lot of high-rise residential buildings, and most of those have been refurbishment. I've looked at many designs, and I am responsible for design myself. Taking your point up, I actually agree with your principle. It is absolutely right for designers to have their designs checked by an independent party. I do it voluntarily when I work with clients I work with on such buildings. I always say to the client, you should have somebody to check that you're happy with what we're doing, an independent, I always call it checks and balances, to be honest. Whether the client or the owner has their own capability to do it, or whether it's an outside party. I see many designs in the industry over the years, and I've been responsible for criticising those designs. And designers are under a lot of pressures, like all of us, when it comes to cost and time. And nothing's ever perfect in this world, and we are in a very discoordinated industry. So I think anything that enhances the quality of checking design, construction, and operations, I think is absolutely to be agreed.
And just to echo colleagues' words, I'm genuinely not a planter, but I'm also a registered chartered architect. And from the perspective, I'm wearing an LGA hat today, but from my perspective of being in industry for a number of years in public sector, it's absolutely essential that there is the rigour of that scrutiny of others being able to at least challenge what it is that we're putting together. And within local government, for many years, worked with teams of clerk of works, and that's, I mean, I know we'll get on to our building quality inspectors section soon, but from that perspective, it's having the rigour of those who know best on the ground to be able to challenge, well, is that practical? Is that the best approach? And from a contractor's perspective, getting their engagement very early on to challenge constructively, and maybe to tell them that they're wrong, but to have that level of challenge, I think it is essential, and it essentially forms part of that whole golden thread that Dame Dooge is talking about. It is not a linear process. We don't just, as a client, have a pot of money, throw it at a consultant team, they do a design, and they throw it out to a contractor, and it ends up lowest common denominator on the building site. It's got to be a joint effort.
Thank you very much, Peter. So you think this is a plant, because I want to put my architect's hat on as well now. Two bits to this. One is, I wasn't sure that probably Scott's presentation probably has been misinterpreted there, which because definitely it is about designers being principal designers. Now, obviously, under CDM, that definition is wider than just architects, and I think that's fine. But it is definitely the right person in the right position there as the principal designer. But the second point is that there's two aspects to this. One is about projects being checked and making sure we've got that rigour, as Pete was saying. But it's also about the individual being checked. And as I've said many times, I've been an architect for 40 years. Nobody's ever come back and asked me whether I'm competent or not. And I think we have got to get to a position in the professions generally, but specifically with architects, where every so often you are checked, just to make sure that you're competent in doing the right job. And I don't think we should sit back and say, great, we've got an institution, we've got ethics, we've got principles, that's fine, don't worry about us. I think that's not true at all. We should be leading from that and saying, we are checkable and we are checked. And I think that's crucial going forward.
Just to confirm, that is what is envisaged in the competence framework, reaccreditation every 5 years, we're suggesting at the moment. So there is that assessment to ensure that you're still competent to work in a higher risk or in scope building.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'll try and be really brief. I'm Adrian Dobson from the RIBA. It was really two just really minor things, really. Just a point on the plan of works, just because it's been mentioned. I should say the RIBA plan of work doesn't talk about roles. It's about activities and outputs at project stages. It's not a schedule of service, although schedule of services may be derived from it. So the RIBA fire overlay to the plan of work will be much more about dealing with the various outputs and also trying to map that to the new regulatory regime when that comes about. The other point I wanted to make was, I think much of what's in the building safety report is really about fragmentation. It's about fragmentation in procurement, it's about fragmentation in professional silos and trade silos in the industry. And I think actually it reveals some fragmentation in the building regulations, because I think there are some tensions between, for example, Part L and Part B that may become exacerbated when we see the next round of revisions, because they're both going to be reviewed at the moment. But I think, if this is really about avoiding, I think what Scott called low probability, high consequence events, it's very interesting to look at history. I was very grateful for the gentleman who talked about the 1932 mining disaster. I think there's probably something we should be learning from that. We've learned a lot from the 1972 Summerlands fire. If you read the recommendations of the Summerlands fire, recommendation 1 is that there should be somebody in charge and making the key decisions and be seen and be responsible for making the key decisions. And the reason that was written in the Summerland report was there were 2 architects on that project, and that led to a lot of confusion. So I think what's important in this area where we define this principal designer role is that it must be somebody who takes that integrated view, is bringing the design together, and similarly the contractor, the principal contractor role, must be somebody who's taking that integrated view, because it's got to be about getting over this fragmentation in our view.